Welcome to the Next Set podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rehan Tahir. This show is going to be about everyday humans who want to train with purpose and perform better in real life. We'll break down strength and conditioning, exercise and fitness, along with mindset with coaches who live it. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. We're talking about stress today, stress and adaptation, and how you can use micro stresses to help build your resilience to everyday stress. We're going to talk about this today on the Next Set podcast. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome and what that might mean, how you might use that to your advantage. There are three main phases with Hans Selye's adaptation syndrome. And the first phase is the alarm phase. You have a sudden stress that comes about. For example, your body hits an alarm reaction, right? It's an uncomfortable feeling, and your immediate reaction is to resist it, is to say, hey, I don't like this feeling. And your body, through the HPA, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, the HPA axis, starts to secrete these corticoid steroids, and basically through that mechanism, your body starts to have a lot of stress response and hormones that come out, adrenaline, that fight or flight feeling that feels very uncomfortable sometimes. And so that's a level of distress. There's a good stress and bad stress. Distress would be basically considered negative stress, or bad stress, those negative feelings that are uncomfortable, compared to eustress, which are generally considered good feelings. You're excited about starting a new job, or you're getting married, or whatever that happy event is. Could be stressful, but it's also a feeling of positive connotations for you. So, in terms of stress, most of us think of distress and how that feels. There are events when you're exercising, for example, that are very stressful. When you're lifting a heavy squat or heavy deadlift, individuals that are familiar with strength training knows if you're going for a max PR, you're going to hype yourself up, and you're going to try to take advantage of that adrenaline and those hormones that are coming through your HPA axis, and try to take advantage of that extra additional strength which comes out of that, right? You've probably heard of situations where a mother, for example, might have superhuman strength if something fell on her child, for example, and she'd be able to lift something that she might not normally be able to lift, from the advantages of coming out of that stress and that those hormones like adrenaline that come out of that experience. Having that superhuman strength can be an advantage. And so when you're weight training heavy and you're lifting heavy weights, you can take advantage of a similar mechanism. So the alarm phase in the Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome, which is really to say, this is uncomfortable, I don't like this, and I want it to stop. And so that could lead to then the next phase, which is basically resistance. And resistance, I think, is where a lot of people end up getting stuck into chronic stress. If you have a very stressful job situation, or you have a very stressful financial situation, or personal relationships, all of that stuff adds up. And when it becomes this daily habit of dealing with chronic stress, then you end up having to really worry about the day-to-day. And when new stress gets piled on and you have to deal with another alarm phase, you're kind of raising now what's called your allostatic load, which is in essence how your body's chronic stress is having to adapt to all of these different inputs. That's probably not a good explanation, but that's the best I can do off the top of my head at the moment. So that allostatic load, which basically is telling us that hey, your chronic stress levels, your ability to deal with that chronic stress is reduced. Your resilience to new stresses is also reduced. And so as your levels of stress increase, trying to deal with all of the different life events that are happening, then any new stress that comes on is going to be amplified that much more. And then you get to a phase of exhaustion in that general adaptation syndrome. And In essence, that's really kind of where I think we see a breakdown in burnout and adrenal issues or disease, right? Because if you think about all these hormones that are constantly having to be dealt with through chronic stress, inflammation, other types of diseases that can come out of having a high level of that kind of stress, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome or other types of diseases, all of these things start to add up. And so having that chronic stress and constantly being under a high allostatic load is not healthy, period. It's not healthy. And so first and foremost, it's like, how do you get out of that high alarm, that chronic stress, that resistance to stress? How do you get out of that phase before it becomes exhaustion and when your body starts to actually break down or your mental state starts to break down? So those are some things to think about. Now, like I said, sometimes stress can be positive. Sometimes stress can be a good thing, especially in small doses. I think that's another point, is the dosing sometimes is the poison, where you might want to expose yourself. You probably heard about exposure therapy in cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, or other types of psychological methods, that's not my scope, but I'm just pointing out that sometimes exposure therapy is used to help overcome a phobia. For example, a little bit of a vulnerable moment, but I had a challenge driving on the freeway and I had a challenge flying, and so I had those challenges for many years, and to be honest, I still have uncomfortable feelings sometimes going through those. But the point is, over time, as you continuously expose yourself to small doses of that stressor, you start to adapt in a positive way, rather than this becoming constantly distressful, constantly leading to that chronic stress moment, or constantly having an alarm go off every time you're in that situation. You start to expose your adaptation to that, and I think that's an important point that I want to talk about in a little bit. So, exercise is certainly a moment where it could be either distress or eustress. A lot of it has to do with our perception. Some people might look at exercise as distressful. They don't like it. And whenever they're forced to do it, it causes a lot of stress, bad stress. And so our perception of how we look at different types of stressors is also important. Someone may love to jump out of a plane and go skydiving. I'm not going to do that, at least not right now in this phase of my life. Maybe at some point I'll get over that feeling of negative stress that comes from thinking about jumping out of a plane. But some people thrive on it. Some people love it. To them, that's exciting. That's eustress. Yeah, they get all the hormones, they get the adrenaline, and they feel that surge, that rush, but they thrive on it. They have learned to adapt their mind and their bodies to perceiving that as a positive thing. So, and I'm going to look at my notes here briefly just to make sure I'm not missing anything. But in essence, I think that's the main takeaway. So just to recap, if stress was completely detrimental, many of the things that we do day to day, they'd break us down immediately. But we all have a level of things that we feel are distressful or eustressful. There's things that we find positive stress or negative stress. Some people love social interactions. For them, that's a positive interaction. Others might find that very stressful and very uncomfortable. So one thing to also talk about is equilibrium. And so when we hit that alarm phase, that's our body's way of saying, I don't like this, this is uncomfortable, and I want to return to what my normal state is. And so that's trying to basically bring you back to equilibrium, homeostasis. When we're exercising and when we're weight training, a good coach will try to find ways to elicit small stressors. Again, the dose is in the poison. The poison is in the dose. And so by giving you the right dose of exercise, whether that's strength training or endurance activity, the hope is that your body will adapt and then recover, and then they'll introduce a new stimulus, a new stressor that your body has to adapt and recover. And so when you continuously repeat the cycle, the hope is that then your performance increases. So it's that stressor or load and recovery, and they go hand in hand. If you have too much load and too much stress and there's no recovery, that's when you start to go into that high allostatic load, the high resistance phase, the chronic stress phase, and then ultimately burnout, where you start to deal with a lot of the negative physical and mental ramifications, like we talked about, high blood pressure and heart disease and mental health issues like depression and anxiety. When there's no end in sight and it's frustrating, then obviously when you're putting yourself through a lot. So a good coach will balance the right load, the right dose, the right stress, enough that you will adapt and make sure that you're recovering appropriately as well. And so this is when other important components come up. Are you getting proper nutrition? Are you eating the appropriate level of calories, the caloric intake, and the right macronutrient ratios for the type of goals that you're looking for? Are you getting proper sleep? Is your nutrient status good? Are you not deficient in any micro minerals or vitamins and minerals or micronutrients? And so a good coach is going to take all of that into assessment. How's your personal life? How's your relationships? How's your work stress? That's all important. And taking that into account to make sure that they're not overburdening your system with too much load on the exercise side. And so this becomes a big part of athlete management. College athletics or pro athletics, they're doing this for a living. They're under high stress environments from a physiological standpoint and also a mental standpoint, because performance is also a lot of mental activity. And so that's where a good coach needs to take into consideration the tactical environment as well, for law enforcement and fire and military type personnel. They have to deal with a high allostatic load at all times. Some of these people are very resilient. They can handle very, very high levels of stress compared to the normal individual. And so some of that could be the way that they've been trained. They've been trained to deal with some of this stress and expect it in their day-to-day life. And some of it could be genetics. Some people are just built a little differently. But I think it also comes back to perception. And so when you have a plan in place, when you have an expectation in place that you're going to have a plan or a strategy to deal with something, that's also kind of a level to say this is not an alarm phase, right? I have a plan for this. I am expecting that this type of event could happen, and I've planned and I've mitigated that type of risk. And so risk management, when you're talking about dealing with stress, is important. So back to the load and recovery. Managing stress is important. We all hear about that from our physicians or our medical professionals when we're dealing with a lot of high stress, but usually we're hearing about that well past the alarm phase. The acute stimulus is probably gone. You're probably dealing with acute stimuli every single day, and you're having this high level of chronic stress, and now you're starting to get high blood pressure and all these other physiological problems, these medical issues, and then now you're told, well, just exercise or just meditate, do yoga, you'll figure it out, right? And so by that time, it's very difficult to kind of bring yourself back from that cliff. Not impossible, but it becomes difficult. And so that's where you need to have a good plan in place to try to bring back down that exhaustion phase, that burnout phase, and try to bring your levels down to a manageable place. So we've talked about Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome, the alarm phase, the resistance stage, the exhaustion stage, which is a dangerous place to be. We've talked about how stress can be a good thing. It could be eustress or distress, but also giving you the right dose so that you actually maximize how your body adapts to things, so that you can have these small doses of stress, adapt, recover and then adapt, and then introduce a smaller new stress. And so that's kind of the theory behind a lot of that, what you might hear in the strength and conditioning circles or from your personal trainer is we want to get progressive overload. We want to get you to a point where you're constantly increasing that small levels of stress. And so we're talking about basically hormesis, which is giving your body a chance, these small doses, these micro doses of stressors, or exposure therapy is another form of that, I would say, so that you can learn how to recover properly from those things and adapt. If you're just training and you're not accounting for recovery, if you think that going into the gym 7 days a week, working out 2 or 3 hours a day, and zero recovery in your plan is a healthy program, I'm sorry, but it's not. And I've worked with individuals, unfortunately, and given them programs, and the enthusiasm is great. They get very excited, and they're like, "Hey, I lost 5 to 10 pounds this last 4 or 5 weeks. So if I was doing that at X amount of calories, 2,200 calories or whatever that might be, and 3 or 4 days of cardio now, then I might want to just do cardio every day and go down to 1,500 calories. Let's ramp this up, right?" And despite giving them reasons not to do that, sometimes they'll take it upon themselves to do that anyways. And then what happens? They start to get that resistance, that chronic stress, because they're still dealing with work and home life or professional life, and sudden stressors that come up. And then a couple weeks later or 3 weeks later, they might get injured, or they start to get super exhausted, and they just really are not recovering. They're wondering why they're sore all the time, and they're wondering why they just really are having a tough time, really having energy to even get out of bed. And so now they've really kind of reached almost that exhaustion phase by pushing themselves to limits that are beyond that right dosing for their body type or their body's capability. So something to think about. Now, what are some strategies that we might use to elicit hormesis, or those micro stresses? You're going to hear a lot about cold water immersion, like ice baths, for example, or cold showers. I don't want to speak a lot about the physiological mechanisms. I mean, I think there's evidence at some point that it does elicit some good feelings, some good neurotransmitters, like dopamine, for example, might be one of them that would come out of that. But for me, I think more importantly, rather than the recovery side or whether or not that's a good thing to do from a post-workout standpoint, I don't really want to talk about that right now. I don't have a lot of, I don't think, that's not really something I think is super valuable in that way, but also I need to do a little bit more research on it too, so I don't want to speak about it. But what I will say is I think that's a great way to introduce a small stress. If you take a cold shower in the morning, give yourself bursts of 10 to 30 seconds of cold water, and first thing in the morning, and then alternate it with hot water if you wish, just to kind of take a small break. It sounds kind of uncomfortable, and it is uncomfortable for a lot of people. I think some people really enjoy it though, but it is one way that you can actually give your body these little micro stresses that you have to deal with and recover from and adapt to. You don't want to sit in the cold shower for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, because then now your body's having to fight back hypothermia and other things if you're in an ice bath for an extended period of time. But the point is that your body's stress resilience will go up. Maybe it's 10 seconds today, in a week it's 30 seconds, and another week after that, or 2 weeks after that, it's 60 seconds that you can handle a cold shower. And so you can see, it's kind of fun to see how your stress levels will diminish with the dose. So 10 seconds didn't really do anything now because you're used to it. Now you need 20 seconds to get the same stress response, and so on and so forth. And so you recover and you adapt, you recover and you adapt. You give your body a chance in a kind of iterative fashion to do that. Having difficult conversations. For some people, that's super stressful. And so maybe that's not a good place to start. But, if you can handle a controlled environment with something that's not super, super triggering for people, you don't want to go in and, maybe having a discussion with your boss or your manager might be a very stressful situation, especially if it's potentially negative. Rather than wait to have a conversation with your boss when things are not going well, maybe have that conversation when things are kind of going okay. and saying, hey, could I have some positive feedback or some negative feedback, just general feedback? Can I have some feedback on how I'm doing? And approach it from a proactive standpoint before things get really negative, and then now it becomes a much more stressful event. You could probably proactively have that kind of conversation and become comfortable with the prospect of having a difficult conversation like that. There's probably other ways, and I'm curious how some of you might approach this. So please do comment. But looking at some of those types of stressful events, I think it's finding ways to find the little things in your life that you don't really want to do, you may not find exciting, or you might find uncomfortable, and taking small steps every day or every few days, finding something that you don't really enjoy or you find a little bit distasteful or stressful, and just giving yourself a little bit of exposure to something like that every single day. I think that would pay huge dividends. For those of you that don't like to exercise, even though you know it's good for you, maybe spend 5 minutes just exercising. Small dose. It could be 3 rounds of jumping jacks for a minute each. It's not something super, super intense, not something too strenuous for a lot of people, depending upon your physical state. And it's not fun if you don't enjoy exercise, but now you're kind of giving your body small doses. That's why programs like, for example, like Couch to 5K, right? Like it's taking you in a situation where you're going from 0 to 60, but you're not doing it overnight. You're doing it in a progressive, staged fashion. So those are some ideas about how you might, elicit some stress. If you're a fan of David Goggins, he talks a lot about this, and not saying I'm advocating his methods in terms of exercise, but there's no doubt that man's mental state is very, very high in terms of performance. He probably has pushed well past the resistance phase several times with his own body, but his mind is in a state where it's so strong that, and it's so calloused to distress, he just approaches it with a completely different mindset. And so, although I'm not advocating for his routine per se, I think he's a very special case. I think we have a lot to learn, all of us do, about his mental fortitude and how he approaches exercise. I mean, the man hates running, has gone on record saying this. He despises it, but that's what he does. He's an ultra runner, he's an ultra marathoner. He's run 200 plus mile races. He puts his shoes out in front of his bed because he hates it so much. He wants to get it out of the way, but he knows that for him that's medicine. And the medicine is, I am doing something that I hate doing because it's uncomfortable, but I also know that it's going to pay dividends for me in terms of how I manage stress and how I perform. And so I think he's a great case study on just that whole mental aspect of sports and performance, and how the rest of us can use a little bit of that example about giving ourselves a kind of a daily task, a daily habit to find one thing we don't like to do necessarily, one thing we find uncomfortable, whether that's getting on the freeway for people like me who didn't like to drive on the freeway, or getting up and leading a meeting, facilitating a meeting, or making a phone call, something that's uncomfortable. Find something every day, take a small step, build your resilience up, and so that way, hopefully the goal would be that you've adapted yourself to these stressors and to these things. Rather than avoid them, you've taken steps to try to adapt to them, give yourself a chance to recover from them. Don't overwhelm your system with all of these different stressors. Do a little bit, do a small dose, recover, and then plan another one. Try to increase it. Try to stretch yourself a little bit on the next iteration of that, and so on. Recover from that. Do it again. Find something that's a little bit more uncomfortable. Try to increase it a little bit. And so I think then you'll get the picture that if you do that in small enough doses, but consistently over time, you'll probably find that you're a lot more resilient to different types of stressors. So let me know what you think. I didn't really have a lot prepared for this one in terms of notes or research, But I think I just wanted to talk about generally the concepts behind the adaptation syndrome, and generally speaking what those three stages are, and how you might use some small stressors in your life to try to build up some resilience. So I'm curious to see how some of you are doing this in your own life. If you've got suggestions for others, leave a comment. Talk about your own experience, both with maybe hitting the exhaustion phase, or using stress to your advantage, taking small steps. Are there things that you do in your day-to-day life that you really know you just find uncomfortable, but you do it anyways, and what those benefits are? How do you benefit from that, and what have you seen in your life? Till next time, thanks for joining. Thanks for listening to the Next Set podcast. I will say that I'm starting to record guests starting next week. So you're going to start to see some interviews with some great guests. Really excited about that. If you're interested in becoming a guest, I'm still looking for future guests for future podcast episodes. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for you all to just contact me, reach out. I have an application form if you'd like to go a little bit more formal. But even if you just want to contact me directly and think you might be a good fit, I'm looking for folks in the strength and conditioning space, human health and performance space, and I really want to talk to some of you and see what you're all about, see what you got going on, and let's learn together. I'm still learning. It's a lifelong thing for me as well, and I'd love to hear from some of you. Till next time, thanks folks. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening to the Next Set podcast and today's episode. If this episode or previous episodes have helped you think or train differently, please share it with someone who needs it. You can find more coaching resources at apextacticalathletics.com. Put that in the description, and you can find us on Instagram at the Next Set podcast. We'll see you at the next set.